You should urgently do something, but you somehow can't get into the power. A decision is pending, but it's in front of you like a huge mountain and you can't manage to take the first step. Have you ever been in a situation like this? Or you've had a defeat behind you and are so discouraged that you just can't get back on your feet? If this is how you feel now, welcome to your personal coaching session. By the end of this session, you will have met your 4 enemies that keep you in passivity. But you will also learn concrete steps to get out of it. And in addition, you will learn why we live in a time and in a society in which passivity and not getting up is particularly attractive and tempting. I came across this topic through a movie that the older ones among you may still know, Lord of the Rings. It came out a few years ago, and there is a scene that has really stuck with me. It's about King Theoden. King Theoden is a king over the realm of Rohan, and there is an evil one in the Lord of Rings named Sauron. And Sauron is spreading terror and war throughout the world. And King Theoden should actually stand up and say, "Stop, and I'll fight." And then Gandalf, who is a good wizard, comes to Theoden and says, "Theoden, now is the time to fight, rise up." But Theoden hangs limply in his throne and just can't get it together. You can see it in his expression. He hears it, but he's actually totally powerless. His voice is totally weak. And he has a counselor who tells him, "It's all useless, and it's too late anyway." And Gandalf tries all his powers of persuasion, but it doesn't work. In the end, it turns out well. I will tell the story later. But I wonder if there isn't sometimes a King Theoden in us too.
Ob nicht in uns auch manchmal so ein König Theoden steckt.
And maybe that's not how you appear on the outside at all. Maybe you are a very energetic person on the outside who is athletic or totally successful in their job. But maybe you have a situation in your private life where you are stuck. You know, you have to have a difficult conversation, but you always duck away. Or you are totally fine in your private life, you have lots of friends and a good relationship, but whenever there's a headwind at work, you get so small you duck away. Is there an area in your life where you are also like King Theoden, that you don't want to tackle it, that you prefer to bury yourself in passivity? That's my thesis, that there is probably such an area in all of us. This is King Theoden. Actually, he is a king, but the crown sits so crookedly on his head and he looks so intimidated and he just can't get going. How do you recognize this? What are the classic patterns of passivity? The first is you push away what you should actually do. I'll do that tomorrow or after the summer vacation and so on. Or you don't push it away, but you say you have to think about it in detail first. That's also called overthinking. Overthinking means thinking and thinking and thinking and never doing anything. Does that sound familiar? It may also be that you are already feeling a wave of shame about the whole topic. You no longer dare to even look at this huge pile that is piling up because you are already drowning in shame just thinking about it. And finally, you realize there is a deep sense of resignation. The problem is these 4 things, procrastination, overthinking, shame and resignation, can become like a whirlpool that seems pulling you further and further down. I can imagine that it didn't start out that way for Theoden either. Maybe in the beginning he just postponed a battle or didn't want to lead one campaign, but in the end he is completely paralyzed and passive and he can no longer access his power at all. How do you get back into your power when you're stuck in something like that? Then I announce to you that today is a coaching session, and in coaching and therapy and so on, you often start with, how did it begin? And there are 4 possibilities that come to mind. It may be, of course, that Theoden has always been like that. It may be that he just hasn't learned to fight. Maybe he never had to. Maybe the others fought for him. Or his castle was so secure that enemies simply never got in. Or he had some kind of generals who did it for him, and that's why he's all limp and has no muscles. It could also be that he was the son of a great king who always took care of everything. And the first reason why Theoden is unable to find his strength is that he may have been overprotected all his life. So now in a situation where you would have to fight, he doesn't have the tools to do so. He never had to do that. Of course, it can also be like the so-called helicopter parents who practically want to shield the child from everything, especially from difficult things in life, so that the child never learns that at all. For example, I came across this funny book title, Postpone the German Test, It's My Son's Birthday. I haven't read the book, but of course that can be a mentality. If you have been protected from everything since childhood, you may never have learned this inner resilience, to kick up your heels and somehow bite your way through. That's the first possibility of why Theoden became that way. The second possibility is that Theoden is just the kind of guy who says, the fighting, I don't think it's so great because it's kind of evil, so hard, so unfriendly, almost intolerant. It may be that he is just a nice and sweet guy. For men, this is the so-called nice guy. He has smiled his way up for life. Just by being nice, he avoided practically all conflicts. It also happens with girls. That's the nice girl. She was always the princess of the father or the mother, and she always somehow managed to get through by smiling or being beautiful, by being decent, and never had to stand up for anything or never wanted to stand up for anything, which is really uncomfortable. And this second characteristic I call adapted. It is possible that Theoden was such an adapted guy from childhood on, that he never learned to stand up for something. He was always a nice guy and never had to fight for anything. The third reason why he ended up being passive here is a bit more complicated. There is an interesting story in the Old Testament that I want to tell you briefly. It's also about a king, and also a king who somehow did not really do what he could or should have done. His name is Ahab. He is the great opponent of the prophet Elijah. And Ahab has a problem. He doesn't mean any harm, but he lets his wife Jezebel manipulate him for her own purposes. For example, there is a situation in which Ahab imagines that he would actually like to have a vegetable garden from someone else, but it doesn't belong to him and he has scruples and doesn't really know what to do. And then Jezebel, his wife, comes and says to him, "You are king of Israel now. Rise up, eat and be of good cheer. I will get you the vineyard of Naboth of Jezreel." And I mean, what she actually does is have him killed. And she says to him, "Hey, relax." But what she's actually doing is manipulating him for her own purposes. Funnily enough, the filmmaker of Lord of the Rings, that's also in Tolkien's book, but he draws it well that this Theoden has a whisperer, that is Grima, and Grima pursues his own goals. And Ahab also has a counselor with him directly in the family, namely his wife. And interestingly, she is even referred to as a sorceress. So magic has something to do with manipulation. Now you are wondering, why am I telling this story? One of the reasons why people like Grima, by the way, this is Grima. One of the reasons why people like Grima cannot come into their power internally is because they have a toxic relationship in their lives. He has a toxic relationship with Grima. Grima has a voice that speaks discouragement, manipulation, and paralysis into his inner being. And it is similar with King Ahab, it's Jezebel. I call this a toxic relationship, or more generally, a toxic voice. But often it's actually a person. There may be someone in your life who is constantly draining your strength. Maybe it feels familiar. Well, they've always been there, or it's always been like that. but it's something that consistently prevents you from coming into power. Yeah, that always pulls it out like a plug. The fourth and final reason is very understandable. It may be that you or Theoden have tried to fight many times, but it didn't work. I don't know which of you has been in a situation where you were laughed at school. I don't want you to raise your arm, but something like, I tried something and then I was laughed at. In gym class, you run and are supposed to jump far and then you fall, and the whole class laughs, or in dance class, and you can't find a dance partner and so on. That's what we call shame, what comes into our lives. Shame is this feeling, I want to sink into the ground. It's best if I don't exist anymore. And it's very deep within us humans, and when a power of shame is in our lives, then we do not come into activity, then we flee into passivity. I found a wonderful example of how shame works in a film. Tonight it's all about films. Well, everyone draws their education from that which corresponds to their intelligence. And the other movie is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is also a children's movie. It's about a boy named Peter. And Peter is actually destined to become a king, but he is still a little boy. And he also gets a sword. And now the really nasty wolves are coming. And here you see Peter facing the wolves. And the point is, his sword is absolutely strong enough to beat these wolves. In the end, there is even only one left. But what happens in that moment is interesting. One of the wolves starts talking to Peter and says, "Come on, put the knife down, you little boy. Otherwise you'll hurt yourself. You think you're a king? Forget it. You're a nobody." And Peter is really conflicted inside. Does he listen to this voice of shame, or does he take up the sword? And you know this voice too. You know all four patterns. When you are faced with a decision where something is at stake, the whole program begins within you. Like, who are you anyway? You've tried it so many times before and it didn't work out the last time either. And that is the voice of shame. Now, of course, the exciting question is, how do we get out of this? Because all these four things just have one effect. It causes King Theoden not to come into his power, not to do what he could do, to remain passive. And the issue of passivity is really something.
Und das Thema Passivität hat's wirklich in sich.
The perfidious thing about passivity is that it can feel quite pleasant at first. You know, all four things are telling you, hey, just go with the flow, it's more comfortable anyway. And you've been sheltered your whole life, it'll go away on its own. And the toxic voice also somehow says, don't even try. And the voice of shame says, you're the wrong one anyway. And they try to lull you to sleep. And in passivity, it is actually quite comfortable. Nothing happens to you, you are also safe, you have what you are used to. And that is exactly what Grima Wormtongue says to King Theoden. It even says, now leave the poor man alone, he's doing so badly anyway. The first thing you have to realize is passivity is not safe. Passivity claims that if you remain passive, everything will be fine, but in fact the opposite is the case. And once again we see this in a beautiful example from King Theoden. Because the moment he takes up the matter and seizes his sword and strikes the Grima, we will see later how exactly he suddenly no longer looks so old and grey, but like this. And suddenly he's a real man.
Ein ganzer Kerl. Schaut mal, noch vor
You know, just a year ago you couldn't have used this example so easily in Germany, because a year ago everyone was still a pacifist. A year ago, everyone still believed building peace without weapons, and it's a bit like applying the nice guy syndrome to foreign policy. So the hope is, if we're nice, everyone will be nice in the end. But that's a fallacy. The situation in Ukraine, regardless of your political opinion, has taught us otherwise. The problem with pacifism is that it only works as long as everyone is a pacifist. If only one person is not a pacifist, pacifism simply means cowardice, not opposing anything, not defending yourself against the villain. Now, this lecture is not about politics, but the same principle applies to everything in life. There is also an inner pacifism that believes, if I just bury my head in the sand, it will go away by itself, because that's safe. But that's not safe. It just means, I hope I'll somehow get through it. But that's the opposite of being active. It's actually even the opposite of happiness. Because he only comes into his energy when he starts to face things. And this is very, very important. Passivity is not only not safe, but passivity also doesn't make you happy. Not making you happy. Look, your body is not made to be protected from everything. On the contrary, you have muscles that are made to be used. Your immune system is not made to be protected from anything. It needs to deal with germs to some extent, otherwise it will not stay healthy. The same applies to everything, including your intellect, by the way. Your intellect needs the contradiction of others, otherwise you remain stupid. I need contradiction from someone else, otherwise I'll learn nothing new. Everything in life thrives on the fact that we are also in a confrontation. And it is very important to me, for those of you who tend towards the nice guy, the conformist, or the overprotected model, then we believe inwardly, namely the lie, that it is wonderful and that it is safe when we are passive. Who of you had a teacher at school or a gym teacher at school who just didn't demand anything, who let everything slide? You think that's a lot of fun, right? Students have the most fun when the teacher doesn't care about anything, but the opposite is true. You actually want a teacher who challenges you. Imagine a sports coach who says, I don't really care whether you'll come today or not, just chill out your life. And here's the thing, that's exactly how we treat ourselves, and then we wonder why it's no fun. Look, you're also your own coach, your own teacher. You are also your own Gandalf who says to Theoden, hey, come on, stay in bed, chill out. Make yourself another chai latte and watch some Netflix because the word out there is evil anyway. Better be careful, but it's not the path to happiness. This lecture or coaching session, as I said, is also designed to shake up this positive trainer in you and say, no, it's actually okay if it's not fun sometimes. It's okay if it's not fun sometimes. If you only do sports when it's fun, then you'll never do sports. It's important that there are things in your life that are not fun. It's important that there are things in your life where you have to pull yourself together, otherwise you get stuck in your throne with a frozen expression like Theoden. And he doesn't have any fun at all. There's one of those inside you. And I believe that it's clear that it's independent of age and also independent of gender. There's also a warrior inside you, a hero, a fighter. There's not just a little well-behaved, well-adjusted person. I bet there's a battle cry inside of you just waiting to get out, in at least one area of your life. One example that I always like to tell is, if you wish for a life without resistance, don't mistake that for security. Imagine you were at a war, and you are lying in some position That's a very martial example, but you are at war and you're always shooting in one direction and nobody ever shooting back from that direction. You might say, hey, it's a great war, things are going really well for us. The truth is, things are probably not going well for you at all, because if you shoot in a direction where no one ever shoots back, it just shows that you're fighting a losing battle, that nothing is happening at all. Maybe the enemy is even behind you, and that's the most dangerous thing. If you are at war and there is a return fire, that's a good sign. If you get wind in your face, it's a sign that your speed is increasing. If you avoid all resistance, you are in the greatest danger of passing by not only what you are made and called to do, but also who you ultimately are. Passivity does not make you happy. Passivity is not safe. And now I have a dramatic message. But unfortunately, passivity is in fashion. Passivity is unfortunately in fashion, so not everywhere, but not across the board, but there are tendencies towards it. And now I would like to apply these 4 characteristics to our present time and ask, is it possible that society is making it rather difficult for us to get out of this passivity? First of all, with these overprotective ones. I actually believe that there is a trend that is fundamentally positive. The trend is, on average, we have much more harmonious parental homes than we did a few decades ago. Statistically, young people move out of their parents' home later. Many young people say that their parents are good friends or even their best friends. Many young people say, I'm in no hurry at all to move out of home. In education, too, it is of great value. I want to be empathetic. I don't want to overwhelm my children. I tell my children, hey, you are valuable, you're special, I want to support you. All of these are very, very positive trends. However, in the midst of these trends, there is a risk that another part is not being learned in the same way. So I think there is a grain of truth in the somewhat mocking book title, Postpone the German Assignment, It's My Son's Birthday. At the risk of over-caricaturing, I would like to tell you a few stories that I have experienced in the last few weeks that have made me very thoughtful. A brief definition. Overprotection means doing something for you that you can already do yourself. It is important for parents to support their children, but only to the extent that the child is learning along with them. It is perfectly normal for a dad to tie his child's shoes when the child is 2, but it's a bit strange when the dad still does it when the child is 22. And it also requires parents to take a step back and say, okay, hands off. I'm now exposing my child to the reality of doing this themselves. And I think this is becoming less and less common in society. And I am now speaking particularly to you if you're under the age of 30, so Gen Y or Z. I have spoken to 3 employers in the last few weeks, and one of them said the following sentence to me, which is bothering me a lot. He said, hey, I'm having a real hard time finding someone for the job right now. I've already tried several people, but the young people who come to me all have a very, very high expectations of everything except themselves. So in the sense of, I would like to have so and so much money, so and so much vacation, that would be important to me, a 4-day week, and so on. That's all fine, but not the same extent of the thing. And I really buckle down for the first 3 years that they, as the boss, also know why they transfer money to me every month. So there is a very strong provider mentality. Yes, someone has to take care of me somehow. My boss, for example, has to encourage me. But there is less of a feeling that I have to prove that I have something to contribute here. Again, I'm not generalizing, but it is definitely a form of disguised passivity. Because what happens is that a young person avoids proving themselves by saying, I'll take my sword here, I'll put my crown here and I'll prove myself, but rather I expect someone else to do it for me. Someone once told me, especially when he discussed young people in a university or educational environment, that they have such very explicit opinions, also regarding world politics, how everything should continue, economic policy, energy policy, and so on. But they never have been abroad or have not gained much professional experience or anything like that. This could also be summarized as so many opinions for so little experience. It's like, I expect that my opinion is basically heard, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to prove myself here first as someone who can substantiate his opinion.
Erwiesen haben muss als jemand, der diese Meinung auch substanziell untermauern kann.
What's behind it, dear ones, is very important. And now I have to go into philosophy or psychology for a moment.
Ja, ihr habt es schon geahnt, genau, was Psychologisches.
The longing for unconditional acceptance is deeply rooted in us humans. But the truth is, in the world of humans, there is no such thing as unconditional acceptance. If you expect to be accepted unconditionally in the world, you are on a pre-programmed course towards bitterness, because that won't happen. Your boss doesn't have it in their heart to accept you unconditionally. That's not their job at all. And society is also not waiting for you to finally express yourself in your individuality so that everyone can applaud the magnificence of your existence. Maybe your parents do that in the best case, but if they are smart, they also attach certain conditions to it, that they say, I love you unconditionally, but my love also consists of encouraging you, of expecting things of you. That too is love. Or your spouse, your best friends, they say, you can totally mess up, you're still my best friend, that's wonderful. But it would be very strange if the world would treat you like that. And to the extent that we encourage young people and say, you are totally special, it's not what you do, but who you are. You are awesome by your very being. To the extent that you then expect you to receive this echo from all sides, you are on a pre-planned path to more and more wounds, because the world is not like that. On a level of friendship it is, but our social interaction is of course also based on performance. Performance means negotiating expectations. It's not that the bus driver is so important to me by virtue of his existence as a person that I don't care whether he gets me to my destination. It doesn't go that far. I can totally affirm him as a human being, but as a bus driver, I expect that when I have bought my ticket, he will take me from A to B. And that's how it works in a social structure. We negotiate expectations. And if you have a job, your boss is not just your best friend who, simply because you are young, creative, and awesome, tells you how young, creative, and awesome you are every morning. He also has the expectation that you do what is required, just as you have a legitimate expectation that he will pay you and provide you with what you need to work. This is perfectly clear. But back to this voice here of Grima. Grima says a sentence at one point that I find so interesting. I think it's only in the extended version for advanced Tolkien fans. He says to Gandalf, "Why trouble an already troubled man?" He says, why trouble a man who is already doing so badly with such terrible topics as war? Dear ones, that voice, it may be that the voice is within you. That's not a good voice, because the guy is actually made to come into his power. He's much better off when he comes into his power. And there is a false voice of self-empathy that is not self-empathy at all, but it's self-pampering, and it's not good for you. Distinguish very well there. What is healthy self-acceptance, which says, Johannes, today you can just feel good and you don't have to do anything today. We need that. And then we also need the voice, but now you get up. And now you do something. And now you don't feel like doing sports or taking a cold shower or going to work, but that's also part of it. This voice sounds nice, but it's not nice. Dear ones, stress is good. We live very much in a culture where stress has negative connotations. Don't stress me. But if you want to avoid everything that is stressful, you will end up avoiding life altogether. Because life is sometimes stressful. Challenges are sometimes stressful. We are experiencing the opposite. Now, I just have to be careful to land a point here. We are experiencing the opposite. We are so addicted to dopamine that we are less and less willing to face real challenges. Dopamine is released every time something flashes on your cell phone and you discover something new. Dopamine is actually this dumbass hormone. Whenever an apple flashes, press on apple, a computer game. I shoot them all, the orcs. Yeah, but in real life you don't face an orc. Because you simply connect a short-circuit generator to your brain with more and more dopamine. And for boys it's computer games, for girls it's likes on Pinterest. Oh, nice, you saw me, or oh, chai latte, what do you think of my new hairstyle? And I myself, I'm a completely, even if I'm not Gen Z, I'm probably M or B or so, I'm totally at risk from it. But there is also this dopamine addiction, which masquerades as self-indulgence, where after 8 hours of Netflix and gaming you realize that your life is slipping away and you are starting to look like this and not coming into your power. And that's over now. By the way, that's the last one. We love Gen X, Y, and Z, and whatever they're called. And we really love them when we understand that they no longer tick like they used to. Pressure and hierarchy don't work for them. They have understood something. And now it is about a part that is still necessary for maturity, namely taking responsibility. Stress can be good. Stress is not always bad.
Have you noticed there are no ads on this channel? This is the only one. One reason for that, this channel is funded by donations only. If you want to help us to continue with this work, you find everything about supporting us below in the description. Now enjoy the rest of the video.
Let's move on to the second point. So my thesis was that these 4 reasons for passivity are in fashion right now, that they are en vogue. The second one, conforming. We live in a very nice culture. Being nice is a very high value. It is very badly regarded to be someone who is in many conflicts. There are certainly conflict types, but I'll give you an example. We live in interconnected times, and that's stark. On the internet, you potentially give everyone the right to evaluate you, positively or negatively. I sometimes get a fright when people post selfies because I think to myself, okay, anonymous people, you would never ask for advice. You're asking for something very intimate, namely an assessment of your appearance. Well, I don't actually go around asking people I barely know, what do you think of my face? Because how would you actually deal with it if someone were to say, your face is terrible? And on the internet, we end up doing just that. And that's why I think we're becoming more and more sensitive, which is positive, but also more and more thin-skinned, which is negative. I'll show you a statistic from a study that came out in June 22 in the UK among university students. And only when you understand it will you know why I don't find it harmless. The blue is 22, and the green is 2016. And all students were asked, which is more important? That everyone at the university is free to express their opinion in a debate? Or is it more important that no one's feelings are hurt? And in 2016, 37% said, it is more important that all students are practically protected from discrimination or from negative feelings or from being offended than free speech, which is already fierce. In 22, this average almost doubled to 61%. That means 61% of students say it is more important that no one feels discriminated against by any opinion expressed than that freedom of speech prevails. That is crazy. On the left it says, what is more important, free speech on campus, even if it sometimes offends people, What is more important?
Auch wenn Leute manchmal daran offended sind, also Anstoß nehmen, was ist wichtiger?
In 2016, 27% said freedom of expression was more important. In 22, only 17% said that. 17% of these students say freedom of expression is more important than whether someone is offended by it or personally offended. We live in a culture that rewards conformity and niceness.
Angepasst und nett ist und die angepasst und nette Menschen belohnt.
And that is dangerous.
Gefährlich.
Because if you are too nice, you will eventually become dishonest. And if you are too nice, you will value everyone else's ideals and standards higher than your own. And I would even go so far as to say that if you only want to be nice, you will eventually lose self-respect. In the end, you respect everyone else but yourself. Because deep down you feel that you are not taking responsibility for anything, that you have become that way, that you have become tame and that you have become cowardly. And being nice and love is not the same. Third point, toxic relationships. I only want to touch on this briefly, because toxic voices and relationships are, of course, even more powerful in the media age. It's much easier to get to know people and much harder to get rid of them. If you've ever had an ex, you never wanted to hear from them again. It's not that easy with a cell phone if they have your number. So unfortunately, getting out of such clutches of I'm attached to someone who is not good for me is much more difficult in the age of the internet. That's why this topic is important. Fourth and final topic, shame and embarrassment. We live in a time that deals a lot with negative feelings, with embarrassment, or this is somewhat related with hopelessness and resignation.
Mit Hoffnungslosigkeit, es bringt eh nichts, wie du bist mit Resignation sehr sich wirft.
A few weeks ago, I came across a post from a TV program on German public television that really touched me in a negative way. Then I posted something about it, and then a big discussion started. Before I show it, I want to make one thing completely clear. I do not want to trivialize COVID-19 or climate change. I consider climate change to be a huge challenge, and I think it's important to provide information about it and to deal with it. Ecology is a very important topic that we have to deal with. And now the question is, how should we deal with it? And in this post, the headline was that a child born today is much more likely to experience forest fires, flooding and heat waves. And in the middle you see the poor child who is doing so badly. And what annoyed me so much about this post was not what it said, although it is incomplete, but the mentality behind it. When you see this, you feel really sorry for the baby. You think, oh, you really live in terrible times, you feel really bad. I would like to say, yeah, in terrible times. You have probably never experienced war, never been tortured. You have never had to starve or freeze for a night. If you press a button, you can book a flight to Paris on the internet. You always get hot water out of the wall. That means we live in conditions that in terms of human history would make anyone say, you are a god or you are a king. And you are actually doing incredibly well. But we present it in such a negative way. What we also don't say is we do have more forest fires and all that kinds of things. But what isn't mentioned is that many fewer people die and much less damage happens as a result of all these disasters than 50 or 100 years ago because the technologies for dealing with them have improved. I'm not trivializing climate change by saying that, but I am saying that one-sidedly negative reporting and warnings also have negative consequences. Just as with Corona.
Genauso wie bei Corona. Ich glaube, auch Hoffnung, auch
I believe that hope and a positive mentality to look ahead is also an asset in our society. You can't just keep warning. You can't just say every day that it's totally bad, that the world is bad. At some point it paralyzes you. Or at some point the reaction comes that someone says, screw you all, I don't believe you anymore. I don't care about ecology, climate change. I don't care about anything. These defensive reactions are just as bad. We humans need much more than just this constant negative stuff. You know, in the 60s, the great civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, the speech began with, "I have a dream." Today, our big speeches tend to be more like, "I have a nightmare," not "I have a dream," or "I want you to panic." It's all kind of bad. And friends, we really do live in a climate of discouragement, especially in Germany. Because of all the issues, be it climate, corona, in Germany it is always especially worse. In the past, people said that there is this German Angst. And obviously there is something to it. And I'm happy to say it for the third or fourth time, I'm not trivializing any of these things. But we Germans certainly don't have an abundance of positive activism. As Kurt Tucholsky said so beautifully in the 20s or 30s, if the German has nothing else left, he has still one thing at the end: concerns. There is some truth to that, especially if you compare it to other countries. In Germany, we have a strong feeling, I think in German-speaking countries in general, a feeling of, yeah, it's actually difficult. You should better adapt and stay on the right side. And it's time that changed.
Bleib mal lieber brav. Und es ist Zeit, dass das endet.
I find it so interesting, for example, my grandfather, who was part of the really classic post-war generation, he came home from the war, which he didn't want to be a part of. He wasn't a Nazi. He spent the best 5 years of his life on some stupid Eastern Front and came back and was expelled from his homeland because there were other people now, and they had nothing and had to build everything. And he said something like, "We just didn't have time to think." I'm not saying that it was always healthy. They probably suppressed things too, but they were just thrown into action, where we just tweet and Google instead how bad the world is and do nothing at all. Maybe the other extreme. I want to say one last thing about shaming, and then we'll hear how it goes on with Theodine, but the point is important to me. One of the most profound forms of humiliation is to be rejected sexually. And this affects men more than women, because in our culture in general, men tend to court women. There is also a biological, historical reason for this. And as a man, if you are rejected by a woman or are afraid of being rejected by a woman, it's a great humiliation, a great shame. When we talk about passivity, I have a theory that I cannot prove, but I believe that a great many men are secretly afraid of women. And maybe also because they also had an over-mama, an overprotection, but never got out of the thing to stand in front of the woman because they were so afraid. What do I do if she laughs at me? What if she says you're fat or ugly? And if you're listening to this now and you're a man, if this applies to you, then please continue listening to the lecture, because this is also one of the reasons why this Theodine may be tied up in you, and you just have to stand up and stop being ashamed of being a man. Women are waiting for you not to stay small, but to take your stand. I think women have something similar, but I'm not one myself, so I don't know. But it's common for men, okay? What happens next with King Theodine? Yep, first of all, it continues positively. He gets up, puts on his crown, a light comes back into his eyes and life returns, and he actually starts to fight Sauron.
Und fängt an, tatsächlich gegen Sauron zu kämpfen.
And he becomes an inspiration to the others as well, and he goes into battle, and I think it's very wise of Tolkien to write what happens next. He goes into battle and falls. He dies. Now you might think, okay, that's a bad ending, but it's very nicely drawn in the book and also in the movie that he dies, but he dies knowing that he has done the right thing. I definitely don't want to glorify the heroic death in any way. That's completely banal. But it goes deeper. And the fact is that we are all afraid of dying. And there is not only the big dying, but also the small dying. And every decision you make is a small dying. When you decide on one partner, you decide against all others. When you decide on this one job, You have to die to the other options. And that's life. Nietzsche once said it so beautifully about fruit. He says, everything that is ripe wants to die. Only when a fruit is ready to fall from the tree at some point and die, only then it is edible, and only then does it bear fruit. Not only wanting to die, always wanting to keep everything safe is ultimately not wanting to live. Passivity is the desire not to die. Now you might say, okay, but who wants to die? Nobody wants to die. But not wanting to die simply means not having the courage to live. Then you have to stay in bed, lock yourself up. That's why not wanting to die is cowardice in the face of life. There is no life, and especially no fruitful life, without the willingness to die. I think once again, it's about a lot of movies. In the movie Braveheart, there is an interesting statement. And this is one of those stories. Mel Gibson plays the leading role. He is someone who actually dies for his ideals and for freedom. And the night before, his lover or wife says to him, "But aren't you afraid to die?" And he says, "All men must die, but not all men have lived." All men must die, but not all men have lived. You see, this courage to make a decision is what brings life. There is another story, also a bit warlike, but I find it very inspiring. On D-Day on Omaha Beach, the American and British troops landed, and they wanted to take this beach in June 1944 in order to ultimately liberate Europe from the Nazis. And in some parts of the beach it went well, and in some it went very badly. And there is, hidden by history, a specific situation where there were very high dunes. I don't know if you've ever been to Normandy, but there are very high dunes there, and there are strong tides. And the Americans landed and still had 50 or 100 meters to go to these dunes, and a group of soldiers, maybe 50 or 60, were taking heavy fire. They were machine guns on the dunes and they couldn't get up. Many had already been killed. So they huddled down at the bottom of the dunes. And the problem is the tide came back, the water came closer and closer, and there was no way out. And this situation was, everyone was paralyzed, like King Theoden. And there was one officer who said the famous sentence, "We're dying down here on the beach. Let's go up on the dunes and die there." And with that sentence, he triggered something. So everyone started running, and in fact, they didn't die. Or not all of them. But they actually took this hill, and that was one of the strategic victories, as far as I know, at least on Omaha Beach on D-Day. And this attitude, I am willing not to keep everything safe, but to face it, to take a risk, even the risk of dying, is the basic prerequisite for getting out of passivity. And then, of course, there is an even deeper level. In the case of Jesus, the willingness to actually face death is a condition to become his disciples. Now let's get out of a bit of a motivational message and go a little deeper into what Jesus says about what it means to follow him. That's a bit more realistic than just take control of your life.
Was es heißt, ihm nachzufolgen. Das ist nämlich ein bisschen realistischer, als dass nur sagt, nimm dein Leben in die Hand. Sagt,
he says in Matthew 16, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." It's not necessarily a passage that is so popular today and written on every calendar. To deny oneself doesn't mean not to love oneself or to not realize one's potential. But it does mean that it's not just all about that, and it means to put oneself in the service of something greater. And he takes up his cross. Let me explain this briefly. The method of execution by crucifixion was known at the time, and those condemned to crucifixion had to carry their cross outside the city and were executed there. Now, the bad news is, each of you is likely to die. By the way, so am I. Jesus doesn't say, take up my cross. And he doesn't say that you all have to die on the cross, but there is a way you will die. And there are small ways and big ways to die. The big kind is how you will really die one day. This courage to say, I have this one life and I'm ready to face it. But there are also small crosses that are assigned to you. And John the Baptist says at the beginning of the Gospel of John, He is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. You don't have to carry the sins of the world. You don't have to carry the cross of the whole world either, or the cross of Jesus. You don't have to carry the cross of anyone else either but yours. And that doesn't overwhelm you because Jesus goes with you and also helps you. But you have your thing to carry, and it's actually even a prerequisite. Only in this way you come into freedom. Now you could say, okay, I'll make the decision now. But it wasn't that easy for Theoden. And the question is, how do you get out of it when these powers are trying to attach themselves to you here? Because this thing is, in real life, they're like shackles that want to hold you. The author of Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, didn't write the scene that way, but Peter Jackson presented it quite dramatically, like an exorcism. You may know it from the movie. Theoden, for example, is like possessed by this spirit, and Gandalf has to exorcise him. I find it interesting. Why did Peter Jackson take that from horror thrillers or the deepest Catholic rituals? I think it's because he has an intuition. These parts, these passivity, can be like a spirit on you that you cannot get out of. And we don't always need this message that Jesus is a good role model and all that. But Jesus is also the Redeemer who frees us from such chains and powers and bondages. And this passivity and this getting stuck is something like that. We humans can go astray and get stuck in wafts of mists, in inner cobwebs, where we can't get out and where we need the power of Jesus to set us free. The good news is that it's strong enough if you want it to be. That's why I love this scene where Gandalf finally frees him from this spirit and afterwards he comes back into his strength. Paul, or the author of the second letter to Timothy, speaks about exactly these two different spirits. He says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. There is obviously a spirit of cowardice, where you are discouraged, where you don't get going, but a spirit of power, of love, and of a sound mind. Sophronisme, or prudence, means the ability to assess things wisely. That's also interesting. The Spirit of God is not so gaga that you somehow become weird, but it's one of strength, of love, and of wise assessment of what is important now. And the goal is that you are liberated from these attachments to these spirits, and that you move in a spirit of strength, love, and self-control. But what is actually very important, what you heard before, take up your cross. This also has something to do with dying. And in the end, dear ones, these four parts are much less harmless than they look. What is it to be conformed? In the end, being conformed is nothing more than the fear of men. To honor people more than the truth, that is not good. What is the spirit of overprotection? It is one of refusing to take responsibility, actually of laziness, of inertia, shame, and toxic voices. When I say that Jesus not only gave us a good example, but also sets us free, what he means is that he actually carried these four things with him to the cross, so that you can come into freedom. not just into the freedom of going to heaven or feeling better emotionally, but also into your potential, into doing the things you were made for. That is a fight. There is a fight, a race that you are made for. And all the New Testament authors are full of it. 2 Peter, therefore make every effort to add your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge self-control. This is very important if you were to say that it's only about faith, only what I believe in my head or heart. But Peter says, well, go ahead and add virtue to your faith. Virtue means good habits that have become second nature. With virtue, knowledge, does that have something to do with the brain? That it's important what you think and how you think? And with knowledge, self-control. Self-control, the definition is the ability to say no. And if you can't say no, your yes isn't worth much either. That's why self-control is important. With self-control comes endurance. Endurance means following through with unpleasant decisions, even if they're not fun in the long run. That's just a Hartl translation here. And now, if all this is present and growing in you, then it takes away your sluggishness and unfruitfulness. Do you want to know how sluggishness and unfruitfulness come out of your life? Here's a description. And it's also great to see. It's not that only we have a problem of sluggishness and unfruitfulness. It has obviously always existed, so that you may know our Lord Jesus Christ more and more deeply. How beautiful. It's not a slave morality, because otherwise you're evil. No, because a treasure is waiting for you, because then you will recognize something deeper about God. Finally, how can you take a few concrete steps?
Steps gehen. Ich gebe euch
I'll give you 6 small steps. First, choose a small step. Which step? Well, look here. This is all that interests you. This is called the area of interest. For example, it includes what Olaf Scholz should do. It includes what Vladimir Putin will do next. It includes what my daughter-in-law should do differently. It includes what might happen to my heart valve next year. That's everything that interests you. Now, there is a smaller area, but it's much more interesting, and that's the area of influence. The area of influence is the part of your area of interest over which you have direct influence. That means that I don't necessarily have influence over the actions of my daughter-in-law, nor do I necessarily have direct influence over what happens to my heart valve, but what do I have influence over with regard to my heart valve? Exactly whether I smoke or exercise. I may not have direct influence on my daughter-in-law, but I may have influence on some things, namely those that I can change. Now the point is, the more you only deal with the area of interest and think all day about how evil the politicians are, the smaller your sphere of influence becomes, because you are only concerned with nonsense. And the other way round is also true. If you take a small step away from something that you can really change, the nice thing is that your sphere of influence gradually grows as a result. You could also say that you are slowly moving from passivity to activity again. This rewards you with dopamine, with some clicks and nonsense. You can play computer games as much as you want, get as many likes on Pinterest as you want, but real life is this. Take one small step, not 100 small steps, and start with something practical. Not with something like, I want to be a better father or a better person, but with something practical. I want to clean up my desk. I'll work out 3 times a week. I'll take cold showers, I'll go to bed earlier, I'll get up earlier or eat healthier. Start with something practical. It doesn't have to feel spiritual or sacred, it can be something mundane, but follow through with it. And third, expect setbacks, because it won't always work, but that's normal. If a child stopped walking when they fell down, they would never learn to walk. And it's the same with everything you learn. Expect setbacks and find a person to go through with it. Come on, and we'll keep telling each other how we're doing. Fifth, see it spiritually, even if it's only about feeding yourself differently. Know that there are spiritual forces that want nothing more than for you to get stuck in the Theodene pattern. You'll notice it. It's like everything is suddenly conspiring against you. But don't forget, when someone fights back, it's a good sign. And very important, don't ask, what type am I? I'm not much of an early riser. I'm not the type. I don't like the green stuff. I'm not the type for sports. I'm not the tidy type. I'm not the type for cold showers. But ask, who would I be? Or who would I want to be? Who could you be if you didn't use passivity and laziness as an excuse? Because the sentence, "That's just the way I am," is the national park and reservoir for non-change. It's just the excuse for I don't want to change, so I'll just say I'm the way I am. I'll just give you these two areas at the end. I could only touch on them now. But there is an area of interest. That's all that's going around in your head. And it's allowed to, but you won't actively change anything there. That's why getting out of passivity and into activity has to do with consciously tackling your sphere of influence step by step, day by day, because you are called to do so.
Tag für Tag in Angriff nimmst, denn du bist dafür, hierfür berufen. Ich ende mit einer wunderschönen
I will end with a beautiful passage from the last book of the Bible where Jesus speaks to the seer John in one of the so-called epistles of Revelation. He who conquers and holds fast to the works until the end. That's a bit uncomfortable because he says not only to the words but to the works. I'll give him power over the nations. Now you might say, I don't necessarily want power over the nations. But what is meant is, you can be trusted with more. You have proven yourself faithful, and your sphere of influence will grow. You can have a positive influence on more. And one last thing, if you fail, that's another nice saying, if you're afraid of failing. By the way, even if you're a man and you're afraid of the woman, if I address her, maybe she'll say no. Maybe you'll fail. But you can also fail forward. You can say, I'll fail and tomorrow again and the day after tomorrow again, but I'll fail forward. Just like the guy at the dunes said, we're going to die anyway, so let's die at the top of the mountain. You'll die anyway, but you can die fruitfully or unfruitfully. You have to live anyway. You can live tame and harmless, or you can live fruitfully, boldly and daringly, so that you don't lose self-respect, but even inspire other people. And that's what you're really made for. And if you can't do it right away, and if you might feel discouraged by this lecture, I just want to say that it's not about becoming a champion right away and doing everything right. I'm actually saying this to you right now if you're currently unemployed or sick or stuck at the computer and have no friends and feel you'll never get out of this, then I actually want to say to you that you can do it, that those voices of shame are simply lies. They are lies and you can get out of them, and you can do it, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Get rid of that inner toxic voice of Grima Wormtongue. There is an enemy of men, and there is an enemy of your calling. At the moment Peter takes his sword and says, enough is enough, the wolves run away. And you will experience the same if you want that. God will help you to do so. That's how it is.